There's a great series of science fiction books written in the 1990s called Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars. And what this fellow wants to do is what was science fiction just a couple of decades ago. And people are signing up for it. NASA is planning a mission to go out and pick up an asteroid, a near-Earth asteroid, and bring it back to the vicinity of Earth so they can see how that could be done. The same technique might come in handy someday when they have to move an asteroid that's coming towards Earth out of the way. But behind it is another trope from science fiction, which is mining asteroids. So NASA is getting ready for this mission. Now, how do we think of this new world of man extending through our own solar system? Raises interesting questions. Who claims the moon and the planets? When we went to the moon, we planted a flag, but we didn't claim it. I wonder if the Chinese are thinking differently, because they're now getting ready to send a manned mission to the moon. I don't know when it'll happen. But I wonder if the Chinese will resist making some sort of claim. And I would guess if the Chinese get there, they'll find a way to make use of the moon more than we've done since we last traveled there. Now, since I'm in space, lost in space, you might say, let me get a little bit closer to our home planet. There are over 1,000 operational satellites, more machines made by the hand of man, in orbit around our planet. And there's a space station. From that vantage point, we have learned much about the complexity of our own planet. I don't know if any of you saw this summer this wonderful NOVA program about the Earth from space. If you haven't seen it, look for it. Maybe it's possible to get it. In fact, I bet it is. They're probably giving it away during pledge time on PBS. But it's a wonderful hour and a half, I think, basically taking advantage of all of these satellites and the space station that we have above Earth to look back at our planet. And what they see is a planet of incredible complexity. For example, ice in glaciers forming off the coast of Antarctica. When the ice forms, the salt drops out of the ice, and the salt becomes part of a very dense brine, which sinks off the coast of Antarctica. And this brine, this heavy seawater, cold, heavy seawater, is the origin of currents which moderate the temperature, which flow all over the globe and moderate the temperature, so that in effect Antarctica is a kind of air conditioner. And from space, they have sensors which allow us to see these currents. In fact, one of their visuals was to show a giant waterfall, the largest waterfall on the planet, which is entirely underwater. It's this heavy, dense brine water reaching the edge of the continental shelf and then plunging into the depths of the ocean. So we're seeing complexity. We're also causing complexity, which you can see from space. We cause complexity through the burning of forests, whether it's intentional or unintentional. You might remember over the summer there was some news about forest fires in Indonesia that were causing horrible smog in the Philippines. We have seen from space clear signs of desertification in the Sahara. We can see the line of vegetation retreating. And we can see from space the dust and sand in increasing amounts kicked up by the storms, the winds, sweeping across the Atlantic Ocean until it comes over the Amazon rainforest, where the dust serves as a crystal, helps to crystallize the rain, and it falls as rain. So that dust from the Sahara is falling with rain in the Amazon. We can see the effects of coal-powered plants in China delivering pollution across the Pacific. We can see the same in terms of coal-powered plants in the United States delivering pollution downwind. So from space, we can not only begin to understand the complex web of weather, of life, of all of our systems, the plumbing that we depend upon to live. We not only can see that complexity, we can see how we're adding to that complexity. The climate now, our climate, is changing at a faster rate than at any time in the last 65 million years. This is according to a report in August from Stanford University. 65 million years ago, there were dinosaurs. And our climate is changing so that the last time it was like this was a long time ago. This year, the CO2 levels in our atmosphere reached levels not seen in the last 3 to 5 million years. The average temperature 3 to 5 million years ago was several degrees warmer than it is now. Not warmer than it will be here in Des Moines today, but warmer. And the sea level was 60 to 120 feet higher than it is now. Now, this does not say that we're going to be drowning soon, or that the climate will go back to where it was 5 million years ago. Not today, not tomorrow, but a lot of people think that's where it's headed. So, what's changing? Everything is changing, including our climate. In New Hampshire, moose are disappearing. They're dying because they are being bitten by thousands of supersized ticks sucking the blood out of these poor mooses, mice, mooses. These ticks are thriving because they're no longer killed in the winter because of the less snow and the milder winters. We can and we need to ask some questions as a result of this change, as a result of this complexity that we are affecting on a global scale. How will climate change affect the availability of food and fresh water? Neither of which can we live without. How do we adapt to this changing world? How do we even make the decisions about how we adapt to this changing world? And when I say we, well, that's a question. Who do we mean by we? If the world is changing around us, if our climate is changing, who is the we? Is it just me and you? Just those of us in this city, those of us in this country? Part of globalization actually means that we really are going to find it very difficult, any place we are, to escape the effects of change every place else. So how do we make decisions about that? What institutions do we have? I'll return to that. Let me give another example of complexity and what we're discovering about it and how we're affecting it. Biological complexity and DNA. It's now 60 years ago that Watson and Crick discovered DNA. And for a long time, we thought it was pretty simple. It was a pretty simple affair. Some of this DNA was the blueprint for making proteins. And these proteins became us, became our cells. Well, science in the past decade has been discovering it's much more complicated than that. They're discovering in the field, for example, of epigenetics. Epigenetics, that means sort of like extragenetic. That it's not a simple matter of the DNA that produces proteins, and that it's not a simple matter of heredity from this DNA. They're discovering that what happened to our grandparents may have been passed down to us through our genes. They've discovered a process called methylation. Methylation is a reaction to stress at the gene level, at the chromosome level. Stress, infection, environmental exposure. The organism responds by turning some genes off and on by attaching these methyl groups to our chromosomes. And what they've discovered is that once these methyl groups attach to our genes, they stay there. And they're reproduced when the genes reproduced, and they're passed down to succeeding generations. They're investigating now what that means. One of the things it could mean is that if you find yourself being a somewhat nervous person, even when you think there's no reason, it may be because your grandmother was nervous, because she was stressed, because conditions were difficult. This is a form of Lamarckism, which is a form of inheritance, which is from the experience of an individual passed directly to descendants, not Darwinian. They're also discovering that some of the 97% of DNA that used to be called junk, because it wasn't directly involved in the production of proteins, is actually not junk. That it plays a significant role in cell development. Some of this DNA seems to code RNA, and this RNA does not directly produce proteins, but it serves as a messenger, regulating DNA activity, turning genes or parts of genes on and off, and thereby affecting cell development and cell behavior. In fact, what this is like, and I love this, this is tremendous stuff, this junk DNA producing RNA messengers that move around our cells in a complicated symphony. When an embryo is growing from its first cell, this process is already going. Did you ever think, how did genes, which are just there, how did one set of genes in one original cell differentiate to all the parts that we are? Well, they've known some of this process for a long time, but they didn't quite know how it works. How it works, the complexity of it, we're just beginning to get an idea of. All of this crazy RNA running around, turning things on and off at the key moments, interacting with everything else going on in the cell. All of this promises an understanding of complexity that we've never had before, of our own complexity, which holds out the possibility of doing things like augmenting our senses. We're already starting that. We've already augmented our senses through things like iPhones, computers, iPads, Androids. Google is now working on Google Glass, and I suspect before we're out of this decade, we'll probably at the very least see Google contacts. so that you'll walk around with these things in your eyes if you wish, which will be an augmented sense. In the past couple of weeks, I read about some folks who were networking monkey brains, connecting brains of monkeys into a network. Also in the news recently were some folks who were growing a brain out of some stem cells, a primitive, very beginning brain. So we are learning more about our own complexity, which gives us the possibility of more complex tools, arrangements. This raises the question of who gets what and at what cost. When you think of what's likely to be happening just within the field of medicine, of biology, with all of the techniques that we're discovering, the Affordable Health Care Plan, the Obamacare plan, which is so controversial now, is just the tiniest little bit of what we may have to deal with, answering the question of who gets what and at what cost as our capabilities increase because of our deepening understanding of the complexity of our own being. A Pew poll in August asked a bunch of people whether they personally would choose to undergo medical treatments to slow the aging process and live to be 120 years old. And the reason why that question is relevant, because they're also discovering something about the aging of our genes. There's something called telomeres, which are the very ends of our chromosomes. And it appears that maybe aging is related to these telomeres breaking and growing shorter. And so these people were asked, would they like to live to be 120? A majority of U.S. adults, 56%, said, what do you think they said? No. They said no. They said no. But roughly 2/3 of them said they thought everybody else would say yes. And the reason they had these two different opinions was that they expect that radically longer lifespans would strain the country's natural resources and be only available to the wealthy. Speaking about wealth, let me turn to economics. In a globalized economy, the question is even more prevalent. Who gets what and who accepts whatever limits have to be imposed? Globalization since the beginning of the industrial age, with the opening of new resources and markets, led to early winners. Those who got there first, who got the colonies, who got the spices, who got the iron ore, whatever. They built the world we now live in. We live in that world. That's what the first world used to be. It meant we were there first, basically. The world started off in which people were more or less equal. Now it's a world in which those who were first reaped and keep the advantage. And now all markets, all labor is tied to one system, and competition has increased exponentially, actually. And so you have to ask, is there enough resources? Is there enough work for everyone? Interesting figure. Only 63.2% of working-age Americans have a job or are looking for one. This is the lowest percentage since 1978. Nearly 90 million Americans are now considered out of the labor force, which is up almost 2 million in just the last year. So when you're talking about is there enough work, this is a problem whether you're in Brazil or the United States or South Africa. In our economy, we also live in a situation where cash is disappearing, but it's also moving around the globe electronically 24/7. Technology, which makes this possible. The hardware underlying our daily existence is growing ever more complex to the point that we need machines to design machines and machines to run machines. We need artificial intelligence to write the software that runs on these machines. Every time they reduce the size of a chip and stick more computing power on it, it opens up a tremendous horizon for increased complexity, doing things in an increasingly complex way, to the point that it becomes very difficult for individual human beings to actually write the software or run the machines. We have household appliances now that we can talk to. There are factories of robots controlled by software, written by machines, and that run from thousands of miles away. We have, in fact, I watched the video today, we have iOS 7 coming out by Apple for my iPhone. Who has iPhones? I'm excited. These great little machines which allow us to do things that we never even imagined, unless you perhaps watched Star Trek. The next generation of computer chips may be grown on DNA, or if not the next generation, the generation after. DNA will be the substrate to grow the next or the next after generation of computer chips. Raising the question, how do we use all this technology? And to whose benefit is it used? We can't say much about what the world will look like in 10 years with this rate of change, much less what it will look like at the end of this century. But we can say a few things. With everything changing so fast, growing so complex, that the human brain alone can't keep up with it. With the world so tightly interwoven, so globalized and connected, we are increasingly going to be subject to the butterfly over the Amazon phenomenon. Do you all know that one? It's premised on the notion that the world that we are discovering and making is an extremely complicated one. Complicated to the point that cause and effect gets lost. The system becomes chaotic. And in a chaotic system, a butterfly flapping its wings over the Amazon may lead to things which produce rain, hopefully, over Iowa. We are entering a singularity, where change happens so fast we can't see it until we've crossed the event horizon. The answers to our questions disappear into the rabbit hole, and we have to ask perhaps Alice where they went. Our financial system may have already entered a singularity, with money moving so fast into such a complexity of places, real and not real. In 2008, we went through this. People were making financial bets with easy flowing money in ways that nobody seemed to understand until it crashed. When it crashed, that's when we fell into the singularity, into the black hole. We're still trying to get out of it. Now, in this world, we can either drown in these waves of chaos, or we can try to surf them, keep our head above water, or perhaps we can try to influence events through our collective action and try to impact the trends and decide the who and the how questions. And this gets me to where I am as a political officer, because all of this requires politics. Politics is how we manage our world, from the depths of space to the inside of our genes. What do we need to do to be able to try this third approach
of trying to direct what's happening to us, or at least influence it. How do we make a world, or try to make a world, that is consistent with our values, rather than something simply that happens to us? Can we do this with a dysfunctional government trapped in partisan bickering? Can we do it in a world that's divided completely into 193 sovereign states? Can we do it in the midst of continuing inequality? These are just questions. But one thing that I think is clear to say, and I'll stop here, is that the world of the Federation of Star Trek, in which it all turns out nicely, just doesn't happen by itself. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
You said that currency is disappearing. Cash is disappearing. What did you mean by that? Did you mean central bank actions, or did you mean with respect to real goods and services like gold or whatever?
I mean, in a very basic sense, who uses cash transfer anymore? It's cards, it's bank transfers, it's paying by over internet, it's PayPal, and at the same time, we've created all sorts of other ways that money can move around. And it's an interesting thing. I'm not in favor of the gold standard. I think that was well past its time. But once money has been freed from cash so that it can become almost anything, people start creating money by making bets on who's going to lose money on something that hasn't been done or grown yet. I don't understand derivatives, but somehow they seem to create money that's not there. And that's why I use this as an example of us falling into beyond the event horizon, into a black hole. We don't know what's happened until it blows up in our face.
Well, a derivative is just a representation of an underlying asset.
The question is, how far underlying is that asset?
Yes.
Okay, and this presentation was what I thought it was going to be, and that's not a bad thing. It was different. And I was wondering, since you were talking about all these different things, I was thinking this would be about maybe isms, elections, ideology, revolutions. I was wondering, do you feel that political scientists are trained in a way that makes them equipped to deal with this global situation of the 21st century?
I'm not a political scientist. I was a political officer. I did practical stuff, not to say anything about my academic colleagues. And so I think about these things in a very practical sense. And the issues and choices that I laid out are my sense, just my sense, of the sorts of macro practical issues we'll have to deal with the rest of this century. But I'm glad you asked me about isms. I mentioned inequality. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the theory of justice by John Rawls. John Rawls wrote this book back in the 70s when I was a graduate student. And he said something very interesting and very simple. He said, imagine that you were going to be born, you hadn't been born yet, but you didn't know how you would be born, whether you would be black, white, woman, a man, what your sexual preference was going to be, where in the world you were going to be. If you imagine yourself in that original situation, what kind of world would you like to be born into? How would you like the world to be designed? So no matter where you were born into it, it would be at least okay. And when you do that, you come up with a standard by which you could judge how close the world we actually live in is to that. And that was his way of saying, okay, that one you can imagine, that's the world of justice. How does that compare to the one we're in? The reason I mention this is if you think about things that way, you get a sense of what inequalities mean. Just to a lot of people in the world, inequality means they want what they don't have. Whether that's a particular economic level,
Maybe it just means food every day and clean water. Maybe it means respect. When we talk about isms, the one that's right now on everybody's mind is fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism. What causes terrorism? What motivates terrorists? And what does that say about the world that we live in and how we might have to deal with it? If we think of it in terms of inequality and justice, by the way, I'm not in favor of running out and leveling everything. That wouldn't be the answer to anybody. It's just a question. It's just a way of taking a look at the world and seeing, okay, if I were here in this world at this point, rather than where I am, how would I feel? What would I do? How would I react? That doesn't explain all isms, but it explains some of them.
In this world of 200 or so countries, and with the increasing pace of change as you described, and the probability of terrible events down the road for many of us, requires some order if we're going to deal with it at all. And right now, our international organization, the United Nations, is powerless to deal with a lot of it when a crisis comes. A lot of nations are looking at the United States as the country, the richest country, the country with by far the biggest army, to keep order. What do you see happening down the road with this situation?
Okay, let's get specific about this and talk about Syria. Very complex situation. Very complex situation. Syria was suffering for a number of years from drought. Started in 2006, continued at least until 2011. I'm not sure what it is now. By 2011, it had reached the point, and the Assad government had made certain decisions about the food they had to sell it for hard currency. And there was the Arab Spring, and there was drought and shortage, and people took to the streets. Assad originally responded to this with some effort at a political opening, releasing political prisoners, talking about talking. The outside world responded with some talk of measures. One thing led to another. His initial efforts didn't pan out with a mild use of force, and basically in the end you had a civil war. I say all this because the situation in Syria is a very complicated one. You have on one hand a legitimate state government. There's a great picture floating around on the internet of John Kerry and his wife having dinner with President Assad and his wife. And this is a legitimate government facing difficulties and responding with force. I was talking about this with my class last week, and we were reminded about Sherman's March to the Sea and the American Civil War, which killed 750,000 soldiers, not including civilians. So civil war is ugly. And then you have a situation in which you have various ethnic groups. None of this is to justify anything. It's just a very complex situation. And when you talk about the United Nations and the United States, well, first of all, who's the United Nations? The United Nations is us. I'm a firm believer in the United Nations. I think we get more out of it than we have any right to expect, given our uneven level of support. Usually we're behind in our dues. We don't contribute troops to peacekeeping. We only put our troops under our own or NATO command. Most of the peacekeepers come from places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. A UN mission is a very, very interesting thing to be part of. I was part of two of them. In East Timor, where my mission we were the police of Timor, of East Timor.
It was our responsibility. The laws of the country were in Portuguese. The people spoke Teton. The mission spoke English. And our cops came from 40-something different countries. And yet, okay, the UN, when it's given a job, as long as the job is not too ambitious, as long as the mandate by the Security Council is achievable. Well, you talk about the UN, it's us. And what's the problem right now vis-a-vis the UN in Syria? Well, first of all, there's no problem. Not completely, because the UN did send its investigators to look into the use of chemical weapons. They're analyzing it. They're doing their job there. Now, the Security Council. The Security Council is us. It's bizarre in a way. All these years after World War II, and who controls the UN? The 5 countries that won World War II. We gave ourselves that job. I mean, frankly, I love the French, but what business do they have on the Security Council now? Even the English. And besides, the Europeans, maybe that should be the German seat, or maybe the EU seat. And what about Brazil and India? So you're starting out with an institution which you could say perhaps is not kept up with the times, because the world is more complicated than it was at the end of World War II. But it is, according to the UN Charter, the law, international law, that the Security Council is the only authority for the use of force. And you know what? The United States signed up to that in 1948. We signed the UN Charter. It was ratified by the Senate. And in our Constitution, a treaty, once approved by the Senate, becomes the law of the land. So we're talking about a situation in which our own law and international law, being the same, would make any unilateral action by any country or group of countries without the Security Council illegal. And if we are going to be the world leader, you might think it would be good for us to set an example and obey international law. We're a country of law. And the use of force, except in self-defense, is legitimate only when approved by the Security Council. Okay, so fine. The Russians block it. Well, that's the system we have. When our state legislatures or Congress pass laws that we don't like, well, what do? We live with them. That's the way things change. And there's no reason, in my view, for the United States to accept the responsibility all by itself of being the police to the world. We have all these Arab states right now. They've been fueling this civil war with weapons and money. But when it comes time to do something, the most they do is say, yeah, okay, good, you do it. Perhaps if we work within the UN and accept whatever happens in the UN, which means if nothing happens, people will feel strongly about it. Maybe they'll say, okay, now we've got to work hard. The Russians are responsive to political events and political opportunities. And in this past day, we've seen very, very interesting developments in which perhaps coming out of some preliminary contacts between President Obama and Putin and between Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov, the Russians sprang forward with this notion of, well, if they give up their chemical weapons, would you not bomb them? And the president really needs an alternative at this point because the country is not for intervention. And what we're doing, we're playing politics right now. We and the Brits and the French are proposing or talking about proposing a resolution in the UN under Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is the use of force chapter. When you pass a resolution under Chapter 7, it means if it doesn't work out, you can use force. And so the Russians' first reaction is, no, we didn't mean that. And so we're in the process. We'll see how it goes. My bet is that something will emerge that covers both of us and allows both of us to avoid doing stupid things. That's my guess. But that's how politics works. And so when you talk about the UN and the US, you have on one side the possible unilateral use of military force by the United States, which returns us in a way to the state of nature, the war of all against all, or you have the United States using and honoring international law. To me, that's a clear alternative, but everyone's entitled to their own opinion.
You had mentioned that there were practical issues that you had mentioned about climate change as well as medicine and technology. Do you have any practical recommendations or things how to address these type of questions and issues?
These are practical questions to me, but at a macro level. And they require, I think, macro responses. And that's why I ended up with the question of how can we deal with these issues when we have such a dysfunctional political system? I don't have the answer. I mean, how do we change how we do government and politics? Our system is withstood the test of time. Right now, it seems to be testing our times.
What you're talking about right now refers to the question I have posed. At the end of your remarks, you posed these 3, 4, 5 big macro questions. And I'm wondering, do you think or do you know of, is there some international organization that is looking at the macro level? Because as I see the UN, maybe uninformed, I don't know how much goes on behind the scenes, but I think of them more as a reactionary group that when there's definite issues that already are causing a problem, they're going to try to lessen it, ameliorate, whatever, but not necessarily plan for these massive questions that are going to affect everybody on the planet and perhaps the solar system. So things don't happen well usually in chaos. It seems like planning often produces a better result. So is there some group, I mean, I've heard of IOHS and some other things, but I don't know if there is a group that's looking to try to turn the course.
Oh, I suspect there are all sorts of groups looking at some of these things. I mean, the world is full of folks looking at things. But the problem is we have no, as I mentioned, no federation of planets. We have no world government. We have the United Nations, which is not even quite a Congress of sovereign states. And we have 193 sovereign state governments, including the United States. And the United States, well, judge for yourself how well this country right now is dealing with issues that are even more pressing, like are we going to pay our debt? Are we going to run out of money? I don't have the answer. There's no single group. This is, but you folks in Iowa have an outsized influence, because every 4 years, what passes for our political class comes here and begs for your favor. You can have them beg harder and smarter as a start.
You mentioned a number of times climate change. I think the long-range picture is important here, which is up until the last few hundred years, the biggest constraint on population and also on consumption was our limited access to energy. And most energy, are dependent heavily on muscle power, even in animal, some wind and some water. But it was the fossil fuel revolution which has allowed the world's population to go from 1 billion to 7 billion, which has allowed massive increases in consumption. But across a long span of human history, that's just, fossil fuel at the rate of consumption is just a blip. Even if you didn't have climate change as a threat, it would be a few hundred years, 400 or 500 years of, we could count on fossil fuels. It's a finite resource. So I think, and of course, climate change is now accelerating the need to transition to something beyond that. But for all those years of human history, we didn't find an alternative. Now we're faced with a very short period of time of fashioning a transition in just a matter of decades.
me, the ultimate question, and I touched on it at the beginning, is how do we collectively make the decisions we have to make? You can come up with any number of problems and issues that we're creating. In fact, running out of fossil fuels is probably not even the most pressing. We have a nearer term question in this area. For example, how far are we going to go with fracking, and what are the costs of that? But theoretically, we have natural gas and oil in the ground to finally make us able to shake off dependence on the rest of the world. And oddly enough, what's the one organization in the world that can think about these things and act upon them? It is the United States. And with cheap gas on the horizon, how motivated are we going to be to look at questions of how to deal with the fossil fuel cycle or alternative energy? We're a market-driven economy. And by the way, one did not need to see the fall of the Soviet Union to know that there's no alternative to markets. There's no alternative. We don't know how to organize anything that doesn't include a market. The question becomes perhaps how do you regulate or organize the market? But markets are the only thing that we know works. And not just economic markets, political markets, which is democracy. Not every country is ready for democracy. And if you look around the world, you see a lot of conflict caused by countries being pushed or pulled into democracy prematurely. You know, we run around with our human rights and democracy, and we're oblivious sometimes to what the condition in a place actually is. If you bring democracy or try to bring democracy to this place, well, the people who don't actually form a nation yet start killing each other first. So we are in the position. We are in the position to lead the dialogue, to provide leadership. We have very many smart people. We have the National Institutes of Health. We have NASA. We have NOAA. We have all sorts of people. We have universities with fine people in them, whether it's social sciences or physical sciences. And then we have Western Europe, and we have a lot of other people all over the world that we could lead, and that's the question. When do we do that? And I think I'll end on this. I like science fiction, and you can tell from my starting out at the edge of the solar system when you didn't expect it. But when I think about the future, this century, and our ability, the ability of our political system to rise to the challenges, that I think, unfortunately,